Morning, guys. Mr. Sherwin here. I thought I'd go over the ACE questions for you, give you some help. I can't type and talk at the same time, so this is for you. So listen closely, get some great examples of what we're looking for to prove your answer. So, number one, explain the causes of the stock market crash of 1929 and the effects of the crash on the American people. If you recall, one of the first things we did when we started this unit was we looked at causes and effects of the stock market crash. And there was a sheet you got where you had to highlight the causes and highlight effects. And so things like Americans spending too much on things they couldn't afford through credit. Okay, unequal distribution of wealth. Okay, lack of bank regulation, dependency on the rich. Okay, all those things are things we talked about. There was laissez-faire going on. There were no regulations of banks, so banks were loaning out money. People were borrowing money to invest in the stock market. It's called buying on the margin, where they only would put up a small percentage. And of course, lots of effects of this. People stopped buying things, consumerism stopped, consumption stopped, industry had to stop producing, so we had surplus, had to lay off workers, people lost jobs, banks closed because of bank runs and things like that. So there were a ton of specific causes and effects of the stock market crash that we talked about. Okay, so I'd again look at that document. Number two, explain how unequal distribution of wealth and debt contributed to the Great Depression. Well, when we just kind of mentioned this, debt refers to people buying on credit, overuse of credit. So many things they were buying on credit. They were buying automobiles and these new electrical appliances. They were borrowing money, going into debt to invest in the stock market, and of course that creates an unstable system when there's so much debt and not enough income. So the unequal distribution of wealth. Again, I'm going to go back to this document. Reliance. Okay, it talks about how in addition to the stock market crash, there was an unequal distribution of wealth. The wealthiest Americans had income 650% greater than those at the bottom. America was dependent upon the investment and spending of the rich. So when those large companies started to lose money, it was a trickle down effect where they would have to lay off workers. Those workers now, instead of buying new things, instead of paying for past purchases, that they're essentially going bankrupt. They're trying to pay for things like electricity and gas and water and things like that. So people stop being able to pay for the things they put on credit, and it's just there's no stability in the market. People aren't buying, so people start to lose jobs. And again, this is another contributing factor to the Great Depression. Okay. Number three, explain how overproduction in the agricultural sector contributed to the Great Depression and how the Dust Bowl exacerbated the challenges faced by farmers. So, if you recall, during World War One, there's a huge demand for food because of not just us, but our allies fighting in the war. We're selling the surplus food to the Allied powers. Of course, when we joined in 1917, we have a huge demand for food for our troops, the doughboys. After World War One, there's a lack of that demand. So farmers who have already been producing a lot, prices are low for foodstuffs. So because there's an overproduction, there's a low demand, and because there's too much of a supply, there's a low price. So farmers are unable to sell their crops at high prices. This is a problem that goes back to populism. So that's why overproduction causes this problem because of lack of demand after World War One. The problem after that in the 1930s, we have them get hit with the Dust Bowl because of all that production that was done during World War One. They over exhausted the soil, and essentially the soil was not strong. Then you have a massive drought in the 1930s in the Great Plains, which essentially dries up all the soil. Now the soil is not held down by any sort of nutrients or grass, and now these giant dust storms pick up that soil and just carry it for miles and miles and miles. So they go from having an overproduction problem to many farmers in the Great Plains not being able to farm at all. And so you see a lot of farm foreclosures in the Great Depression. You see a lot of migrant workers who are going to move from Kansas to places like California. And unfortunately, in California, they're not welcomed. So because everyone's looking for jobs during the Great Depression. And so we talked about this in class, Okies and Arkies. Those are people from Oklahoma and Arkansas who were moving westward in search of work and just couldn't find any because of competition within the United States. Okay. Number four, explain how overproduction and underconsumption contributed to deflation and unemployment. Well, I kind of just went over that with the causes and effects of the Great Depression. Same thing. During the Roaring Twenties, okay, right after World War One, there's a huge demand for new technologies you can buy on credit. The assembly line is going to make goods affordable. There's going to be a massive rise in consumerism, new forms of entertainment in the 20s, new music, new fashions. You can buy vacuum cleaners and dishwashers and all kinds of things, including the automobile. So again, when the Great Depression hits, the stock market hits, there's a surplus of those goods. And instead of people buying new things and even paying for those things they put on credit, like automobiles or vacuum cleaners, whatever, they essentially just say, I can't pay for it. I've got to pay for electricity and water and gas and all those things. And so obviously, demand drops. People who are working in factories that were making those things, they lose their jobs. They go home and they don't have money. They can't spend it. So again, anytime there's lack of demand, there's lack of money being spent, the economy is going to suffer. And so, underconsumption is going to contribute to unemployment. Okay, and as far as deflation goes, because no one has money, money is worth more. It's a supply and demand situation. So, people are hoarding money. In some cases, there was a problem with there was people were hoarding money and because of bank runs and things like that. And remember, John D. Rockefeller had to jump in uh, again and try to bail out the U.S. government from crashing. It didn't happen. Okay. All right. Number five, explain how Great Depression affected life for different segments of society. Kind of already talked about this. Farmers are struggling to grow crops because of the Dust Bowl, some because of overproduction. The middle class are hurting. The old people are hurting. They don't have pensions. Many of them had invested in the stock market, and the vast majority of people didn't invest in the stock market at all. They had just trusted banks with their money, and when banks close, hundreds of thousands of Americans lose all their life savings because of the bank runs. The rich are going to have to lay off workers. The dependency we have on those rich big businesses really trickles down to the lower class. Lower class again struggle with food, with basic utilities, all those things. Okay, and again, I would just think back on the Great Depression and see how Jim Braddock and his family and others were affected by the Great Depression. Okay. Explain the government's response to the Great Depression during the Hoover administration and public opinion of the effectiveness of that response. Well, this is an easy one. During the Great Depression, Hoover doesn't do anything. Remember his mantra of rugged individualism. The government's not going to jump in and do anything. This is going to pass. It's just a little storm. It's going to be okay if you just start working hard and quit complaining. You're going to get out of this. And again, that idea that he came up with, and it's also very similar to how he grew up, sort of working hard to uh, go from nothing to something. He just really thought that Americans, if we just worked hard and hunkered down, we would be okay and get out of this Great Depression. And he didn't realize it was going to become much worse than it was. So there was no direct relief to people. People needed money for simple things like getting the electricity turned back on, paying their mortgages, paying their rent. There was no sort of stimulus that he's willing to do for the American people. The only thing that he did near the end of his presidency was he created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a small attempt to provide public works for folks to work and get some sort of income. So things like the Golden Gate Bridge and the Hoover Dam. Okay, those are some things that he did. Now, public opinion. Obviously, we know the public didn't like what Hoover was doing, and we know this because they blamed him for the problems of the Great Depression. There's so many negative things we think of when we think Hoover. Hoovervilles, those shanty towns. Hoover blankets, newspapers that homeless people would use to keep warm. Hoover hogs, Hoover wagons, Hoover flags, all those things that people blamed Hoover for the problems of the Great Depression. When in reality, and this is not part of the question, but in reality, the Republican presidents before him, laissez faire, high tariffs, are really what led to this. Okay. Okay, moving on to the next section. This is the New Deal section. So I would look back at your New Deal programs. I'd look back at your New Deal Nearpod. Those are the things that are going to help you the most here. Okay. So number 7, explain the government's response to the Great Depression during Franklin Roosevelt's administration, including key programs created as part of FDR's New Deal. This is a great opportunity to obviously say, well, the New Deal was a massive government program to combat all aspects of the Great Depression. We know there's 100 programs. If you say including key programs, that can be intimidating because there's so many. But let's talk about, obviously the three categories. Relief. Give me an example of a relief agency. Okay. The Emergency Relief Agency, that's one. You have a whole list of these that you documented as being relief, recovery, or reform. Relief agency, one that gives money directly to people, okay, or increases a price or a wage, okay. So the Fair Labor Standards Act, that's going to increase wages, so that could be a relief program. Recovery programs, there's a ton of those that provide jobs. The Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority. I'm not going to tell you what those are. You got a chart in front of you that should tell you what those are. So tell me the program, tell me what type of program it was, relief, recovery, or reform, and tell me what it did. Okay. And the last one, of course, is reform. Okay. Programs that were designed to keep us out of the Great Depression. So things like Social Security, things like the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation. So you should be able to, again, tell me the name of the massive program, the New Deal, meant to combat all aspects of the Great Depression, and then some key programs. Give me a relief, give me a recovery, give me reform, and explain what they do. That's a big question. Okay. All right. Number 8, analyze the extent to which New Deal programs address the problems created by the Great Depression. They addressed almost every single problem. They helped young people with things like the National Youth Administration. They helped older people with things like Social Security. Even though it's not officially a New Deal program, Franklin Roosevelt he wants to know how minorities, specifically African Americans, are being impacted by the Great Depression. So he creates this thing called the Black Cabinet, which he gets advice from African Americans on what issues are affecting them. Okay, so farmers are impacted by the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Workers just in cities get increased to their minimum wage, the Fair Labor Standards Act. The stock market is monitored now through the program, the Securities and Exchange Commission. There's so many areas of the country that are helped, so many different programs that help. So you need to give me 2 or 3 and sort of encompass Americans, different groups of Americans, and how they're impacted by the New Deal. Okay. Number 9, compare and contrast Hoover and FDR's responses to the Great Depression, acknowledging shifts in policy for each over time. That's a great question. Remember, Hoover starts with rugged individualism, and then near the end of his presidency realizes he's got to do something, and that's when he shifts to something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, things like the Golden Gate Bridge and the Hoover Dam, and he even created the Emergency Relief Agency, which is a program that FDR would use as well that provides short-term relief to business to Americans. But remember, Hoover starts out only helping businesses. He's not giving direct relief to the people. And eventually that slowly changes, but it's not enough to combat the problems of the Great Depression. Of course, he fails to win re-election, and then FDR comes along, and FDR has 2 plans. They're both called the New Deal. You have the first New Deal, which is heavily supported by Congress because everyone wants to get out of the Great Depression. So things like the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation and the Securities Exchange Commission, those are things that are reform programs that are going to help prevent another Great Depression. Things like the bank holiday, because remember, we got to fix that first because banks are the lifeline for businesses and people. We got to fix those first, make sure they're stable so we can move on from those. Okay. Another shift in policy, remember that there's a second New Deal. A lot of those programs are not readily accepted by Congress because obviously the first New Deal didn't really solve the problems of the Great Depression, just kept us from falling further. They're more engaged in the American people's lives. It's bigger government, stronger government, more powerful government. So a lot of people criticize that. Some other things that happen, programs like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, okay, and the National Recovery Act. Those are programs that are challenged by Congress for being constitutional, and they get thrown out. So, of course, what we start to see is FDR is going to change his strategy on getting New Deal programs, and he attempts to control the Supreme Court, which is going to bring us to number 10. Okay, so understand the differences in each president and how they kind of change their views on the Great Depression and their policies. Okay, number 10, explain the motivation behind and failure of FDR's Judiciary Reorganization Bill / the Supreme Court packing plan or packing scheme. Okay, so again, the motivation, programs like the Agricultural Adjustment Act were seen as being unconstitutional. So they were shot down by the Supreme Court for their constitutionality. And FDR doesn't like this. He wants his programs to be readily accepted and passed through and not challenged. So he makes an attempt to expand the size of the Supreme Court, force justices to retire at certain ages, and essentially he'll be the one that will then appoint judges. So he could have appointed as many as 6 judges, and that way his New Deal policies go through without any sort of challenge to their constitutionality. So that's the motivation, and it's a failure because it violates what? Checks and balances. And that's the biggest criticism that we can look at historically of FDR. Okay. Number 11, identify critics and describe their critiques of FDR's New Deal. You've got this in the Nearpod. You had this. You had they were written for you. Charles Coughlin. He's a Catholic priest who accuses FDR of not doing enough financially to fix the Great Depression. He wants to nationalize the banks. Charles Coughlin gets on the radio, and millions of American Catholics listen to him. He accuses FDR of not doing enough. He wants the coinage of silver to increase the money supply, and that's his criticism. Okay, again, the radio is why he's so important. Okay, another key critic, probably the biggest critic, is Huey P. Long from Louisiana. He has a more liberal approach. He wants his program called Share the Wealth, where we take from the rich and give to the poor. We limit stock in giant companies like Standard Oil. Okay, he believes that Huey P. Long believes that every American deserves a thing like an automobile and a radio and a home. And it's very radical, extreme socialism. Some would say even very approaching communism. And of course, we know what happens to Huey P. Long. Okay. Other critics, you've got Charles Lindbergh, who criticizes FDR not really for the New Deal, but for his lack of isolationism towards the Germans and the Italians in Europe. Okay, but there's one more. There was one more who I'm trying to think of his name now. There was another critic who criticized FDR, basically saying FDR was not doing enough, that he should force old people to retire, and that would free up jobs for other people. So I don't know why I'm forgetting that. Let's see if I can find it in your thing here. That's on your sheet. Okay. Oh, didn't open up. Let's try it again. Nearpod. FDR and the Nearpod. Come on, open up, buddy. There we go. Here it is. Francis Townsend. That's the guy who wanted to create an old age pension plan, force the elderly to retire, and free up jobs. So, again, we've already talked about the criticisms of the court packing plan. When you see this group here, coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans, just remember that Republicans and Democrats criticize FDR for trying to pack the Supreme Court and violate checks and balances. Okay. All right. Last one. Explain short and long-term social, political, and economic effects of the New Deal programs. Again, we're going to go back to this document that we've already seen. Okay. We talked about social impacts. Okay. People are helped financially. The government is more involved in the lives of citizens. No more laissez-faire when it comes to the lives of American people. Okay, political impacts of the New Deal. Okay, a couple things. The court packing scheme was an attempt by FDR, obviously, to violate checks and balances and control the Supreme Court. But as far as politically, one of the big things is that demographics start to shift for parties. The New Deal helps everybody, including minorities. So Democrats, who used to be like pro-slavery and anti-civil rights and almost white supremacists, that party changes. They split. You have sort of the New Deal Democrats who are going to support FDR's New Deal programs. And then in the South, you'll have what's called the Dixiecrats, which are Southern Democrats. And they kind of go their own way. But what you start to see is now minorities are voting in the Democratic side of things. So you start to see a shift. And then you start to see those Dixiecrats later on, they'll reform part of the Republican Party, a more right-wing parties, things like that. So that's a major change, that demographics start to shift and minorities vote for the Democratic Party. Okay, and then economic impacts of the New Deal. Politically, of course, we deal with government. The size of the U.S. government, the power of the U.S. government, all those things increase dramatically. Okay. And then economic impacts of the New Deal. People are helped with jobs, all those recovery programs. People are helped relief-wise. Economically, we don't fall further into depression. We kind of stay even keel. But one of the big things is we go into massive amounts of debt. Deficit spending. We have to spend money to get people back on their feet to make money. So we go in tremendous amount of debt to pay for these New Deal programs. However, we get out of that debt pretty quickly because of war production in World War II. Okay, so I think that was a pretty good review, giving specific examples. You should be prepared for any of these questions. Guaranteed, you're going to have 3 or 4 on your test tomorrow. So, y'all have a great day, and please feel free to ask any questions if you have them. Deuces.